Hello, my name is Shannon Ripley, and I am pleased today to make this little video showing the story of composting in the Bow Valley, as in how do our food scraps that we take to the compost bin end up becoming compost. I am a resident of Canmore, and I've been a volunteer with the local group Canmore Organics Recycling, as well as Bow Valley Climate Action Society. I'm very grateful to the Bow Valley Food Alliance for kindly hosting this video. And basically my background, my training is in soil science and environmental science. And I had the great pleasure of being involved in the planning and startup of the Yellowknife centralized compost facility between 2007 and 2012. And then I've continued working in organics recycling, composting, and waste diversion since. And right now, on the eve of the town of Canmore having a giveaway event for some compost that's been created from the food scraps collected in our community, I thought it might be an opportune time to share a few details about what is the journey of compost and how do our food scraps get converted into compost at a large scale compost facility. I thought people might be curious about that, and given that we're not able to see it in our own community, I thought people might be interested to see a few photos of the composting process. One of my favorite things about composting is how intriguing and interesting the process is, including the activities of the billions of microorganisms that actually carry out the composting process and all the different steps involved that we might not see when we just go drop our food scraps off at the bin. So as much as this has been created in conjunction with the Town of Canmore Compost Giveaway, all of the information here about the general composting process obviously applies to really any large scale composting program. And that means the food scraps that are being collected in Banff, that are collected in Lake Louise right now and sent to a compost facility. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude the original stewards of this land that we live in the Bow Valley, the First Nations of Treaty 7. These are the traditional lands of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina First Nations and Zone 3 Métis people. So composting, which is a way to feed the land, not the landfill. Why do we do it? As many of you who are participating in composting in the Bow Valley know, there are lots of different benefits to composting. We help to reduce waste. We send a lot less material to the landfill when we send it to the composting process rather than putting it in our waste stream. By doing this, we conserve expensive landfill space. We reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Environment Canada did a study a number of years ago, and they found that for every 1 ton of organics that are diverted from landfill and sent to composting, 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions are avoided. And this is mainly through food scraps not being decomposing into methane in the landfill, but rather decomposing into carbon dioxide in the compost pile, and then the finished compost being used on land as a soil amendment. And one of the best parts about composting is that rather than having something go to landfill and having those organic materials be lost, we are creating a really valuable soil amendment that helps to improve soil water holding capacity. It adds nutrients to the soil. There's been a lot of research recently showing that adding compost to soil even helps to deal with some soil-borne pathogens and diseases that can affect our plants. So it's a really beneficial amendment that we can use for growing food. So that is just a very brief background. The town of Banff has been composting, diverting organic materials for composting for more than 10 years now, and recently has kind of reaffirmed and stepped up its commitment to waste reduction with its zero waste trail and its goal of achieving zero waste by 2050. The town of Canmore in 2019 started its own food scraps organics recycling pilot program on a residential scale and has recently just started organics diversion at the commercial level. And in the photo there on the left, you'll see Mara Boroman with a volunteer, Dana McGibbon. Dana was involved in the core Canmore Organics Recycling Group, who had advocated for there to be an organics recycling program in Canmore. And happily, as many of you may have heard or not heard, the town of Canmore actually won an award in 2020 from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for its work to implement organics recycling, and in particular for its creative way of going about it. As you will see on the organics collection bins around town, they've been wrapped with beautiful artwork by local artist Pascal Ouellette. And the town really worked a lot with local community groups in setting up the organics diversion program. So thanks to each of you who've been participating in this program, who really should share in the award and what it's achieved. Right now, the town of Canmore is diverting about 1 ton of food scraps per day through residents participating in this program. And that's even before now the start of the commercial organics diversion program. So I'm going to briefly go through all the steps of the composting process so we can follow the journey of a bucket of food scraps generated here in Canmore or Banff or Lake Louise in the Bow Valley, and to the final step of having finished compost that we can use in our gardens. So the first step is collecting organics materials such as food scraps in our kitchens, in our restaurant kitchens, in our public events. We collect these materials and we put them in our small bin, and then on the residential scale, we take them to one of our community bins, which are wildlife proof, so that bears and other large wildlife can't get in and access the food scraps. As many of you will have seen around Canmore, there's lots of great educational materials around and about right now to help people know what types of materials can be included in the bin. And big shout out and thanks to Metro Vancouver, who actually shared all of their fun artwork from their program with the town of Canmore for free, which then enabled the town to invest some of its program money into things such as the art competition that led to the beautiful artwork that Pascal created. So we have our list of things that can go in the bin. Basically, all types of food scraps can go in, including meat and dairy. Soiled paper, things like paper plates can all go in. And once those materials are put in, we can either take them from our homes, or this photo here, this set of photos here shows other types of events where we can collect food scraps, from a Canada Day event in times gone by before COVID in Banff on the left. And then you can see examples of commercial organics diversion in a commercial setting, both in restaurants, and then also on the right is a photo of a staff member at a grocery store in the fruit tray preparation area, separating out organics to be included in a food organics diversion program. Once the food scraps have been collected in a bin, they are collected by staff. In the case of Canmore and Banff, they're collected by local staff. You can see 2 examples here of using collection trucks to empty the food scraps collection bins, which get really heavy. So in both these cases, there's special hydraulic arms that are lifting up the bins. These organic materials are collected and then they're transported to the compost facility. So in the case of Canmore and Banff, the food scraps are loaded into large tractor trailers, and then they begin their journey along the highways to central Alberta. So there are a couple of different compost facilities where materials from the valley go. They're located in the region around Olds, so kind of between Olds and Red Deer, are where the facilities are located. And I think often people in the valley wonder, why are the materials going so far to go to a compost facility? And there's a couple of reasons for that, which aren't always obvious. I think people sometimes wonder, well, why can't we just compost here locally? And as a bit of a historical note, when Banff first started organics diversion, there actually was a compost facility located right in Banff near the wastewater treatment plant. It produced wonderful category A compost. But one of the big challenges for this facility was that there wasn't a huge market for compost locally. There are many of us who are gardeners who would access and be interested in purchasing a bit of compost, but overall there's not a large agricultural community here in the valley. We have different economic activities going on. Whereas in central Alberta, there's a lot of larger farms that have really a lot of need for the finished soil amendment that compost is, that they can use on their fields to increase soil fertility and water holding capacity. So the economics alone have led to, are one of the main reasons that the compost facilities that are accepting food scraps from the Bow Valley are located in central Alberta, where there are larger scale farms. And I've included here a link to the Environment Canada tool called a greenhouse gas calculator for waste management. I think sometimes people think, oh my goodness, the food scraps are going so far, how can that actually save greenhouse gas emissions? And I found it really interesting running the calculations of what greenhouse gas emissions are being avoided by composting. And it's really interesting to note that transportation of food scraps to the compost facility and even transport of the finished compost back to the Bow Valley is an incredibly small proportion of the greenhouse gas emissions involved when we think of involved or saved when we think of composting. So for example, the amount of fossil fuels in a truck that takes the food scraps to central Alberta is less than 0.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are avoided by actually composting that material. So when we go to invest more community resources in composting, we're much, much, much better served from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective to divert more food scraps into composting than to be starting out by trying to maybe have a facility a lot closer to the Bow Valley. It's something we could look at doing in time, but at the moment, really the biggest bang for buck in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and environmental benefit is by sending more food scraps and other organic materials to composting, where they can be converted into compost and not decompose in the landfill. So moving on, the composting step-by-step material arrives at the compost facility. One of the first things that happens at the compost facility is that there's the removal of non-compostable materials as best as possible. I've been in this role of, this is my friend Kim, colleague who I worked with at the Yellowknife compost facility. You end up by hand removing some of the materials, such as plastic bags. At bigger facilities, there are also some pieces of equipment that are used to remove contaminants, such as plastic bags or large items, or even smaller items such as little pieces of plastic that may have been included in the food scraps and other materials that are arriving at the facility. This leads me to say a huge thank you to everyone who's really diligent about trying to keep plastic and other non-compost materials out of the compost stream. It makes a huge difference in terms of the final quality of the compost, and most of all, as well, the work quality for the people working at the compost facility. And I must note that in conversations with the compost facilities that are accepting food scraps from the Bow Valley, they have repeatedly noted what great quality organics we are sending from the Bow Valley. So congratulations to everyone involved. We've been doing a really good job of keeping non-compostable materials out of our stream, and keep up the great work. And if you ever have questions, contact your local municipality, call them or send an email to ask, hey, is this item that I'm wondering about, is it compostable or not? And then you can follow their instructions. So next, the main thing, one of the biggest things that happens at the compost facility is there's a lot of work done to create a really fantastic home for the billions of hardworking microorganisms that are the ones actually doing all of the work of creating compost from food scraps. So the composting process is basically just managed a way that we as people manage decomposition to make it faster and more efficient. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to mix materials that are high in nitrogen, such as food scraps, with materials high in carbon, such as wood chips and shredded paper. You mix all of those together. Just like us ourselves as people, microorganisms have the same basic needs. They need a good place to live, they need a home, they need air or oxygen, they need water, and they need that to thrive and to do well. And so one of the biggest things in managing the composting process is really trying to create and maintain great conditions for all of those hardworking microorganisms. And when you achieve that, it's incredible how quickly the composting process can work. So throughout the composting process, it needs to be managed. It's an active process. You have, over time, especially on hot days in the summer, you have to add water. The material needs to be turned to reintroduce oxygen as composting takes place. This is a photo from the Yellowknife composting facility. My colleague and friend Micah there is running the fire hose, and then staff at the city of Yellowknife are using the loader to turn the compost windrow and introduce air into the mixture. In turned windrow composting, sometimes rather than using the loader in this photo, a windrow turner is used, which is shown in this photo here, which is basically a specialized piece of equipment that's used to turn the windrow and at times introduce water at the same time. The process continues in winter. This is Yellowknife in winter. This is January. The composting process continues. The materials are being dropped off. Here you can see two staff members adding shredded paper in as a carbon amendment. So just as we generate organics year round, these compost facilities work year round, whether it's winter or summer, no matter the weather. Part of the composting process is to monitor it and to monitor the activities of the microorganisms. One of the biggest ways to do that is to monitor the temperature. In the first few weeks of composting, if you get the right mixture of materials, it's incredible how the material heats up. And one of the requirements in creating good quality compost is to have the temperature of your composting material above 55 degrees Celsius for 15 days. And during that time, to turn the material 5 times if you're using a turned windrow operation, such as are used at the facilities where materials from the Bow Valley are sent. So in these photos here, you can see staff members at a compost facility checking the temperature. This is a windrow that has a temperature in this moment of 70 degrees Celsius. And basically all of that heat comes from the incredible activity of all of the microorganisms. If you took hundreds of people and stuffed them in a room, very much not COVID friendly, stuffed them in a room and fed them a huge buffet of food, and then asked them all to do jumping jacks, it would get very hot in the room. And that's exactly what happens in the compost pile. The microorganisms are moving around, the bacteria, the fungi, the actinomycetes, they're moving around, they're eating food. and they're reproducing, and this generates a lot of heat. And it's by measuring that heat in the compost pile, we can monitor what stage the composting process is at. Here you can see steam coming off of a compost pile at the Yellowknife compost facility in the fall. Just, it's a cooler day and you can see the heat that's being generated from the process. Next, after a period of time, after the initial 15 days, or in some cases a few months of active composting, the compost material enters a phase called curing. And in this phase, the temperature reduces. There's a different community of microorganisms that enter and continue the decomposition process. Some of them are called active neomycetes. The fungi organisms become more active, and they just continue to break down the material over another period of a few months to create the final product that we know that's compost, that has no odor, just smells kind of earthy or pleasant. And as it gets to that stage, we know that we're entering the stage of finished compost. And as a little beware to people, if you run into companies that are selling in-home composters where they say you can create compost in a day, that's actually not biologically possible. You might be able to dehydrate a material or maybe change its properties, but the composting process, which is a biological process, it takes time. It takes, at least a period of about a month, and often a few months in these turned windrow composting facilities. So once the finished compost is produced, it usually is screened to take out any foreign materials or non-compostable materials, and even any wood chips that might have been used in the process that are too big, and they can be recycled and reused for the next batch of compost. You can see a couple of different kinds of screeners here, a deck screener on the left, and then a trommel screener on the right, where material is run through and the foreign material is separated out and will go to landfill. And then you can see the beautiful finished compost on the right. Once the finished compost is produced, any compost facility in Alberta that's selling compost or giving it away has to follow particular procedures to ensure that the compost is high quality. These, the guidelines for compost quality are guidelines that are used across Canada. They were created by the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment. And so a compost facility operator will take samples of compost, send them to a soil testing laboratory or compost testing laboratory, and have the compost analyzed for things such as trace elements, for pathogens, and even just to test the maturity and make sure the compost is ready to be used as a soil amendment. And then it's time to sell or give the compost away or use it locally on a farm. These are some photos from one of the first sales of compost we had at the Yellowknife compost facility. It wasn't a huge scale sale, but people from the community who contributed food scraps were very excited to come out, have compost put into the back of their pickup truck and purchase it, or bring their own bags and fill them up and take them home to use in their gardens. And then it's time to use the compost. So we can use it in our gardens as a soil amendment. We can use it for landscaping on our lawns if we're planting shrubs. And this is a way to use some of the compost. Often at bigger scale compost facilities, they have a lot of volume. And so one of the important ways that compost gets used is in larger scale agriculture, such as in canola. I have some cousins who live in central Alberta. They live not so far from the areas where the compost facilities are located, where materials go from the Bow Valley. And they currently are buying hundreds of tons of compost per year from the Calgary compost facility to use in their canola and wheat farming operation. They've had excellent results from it, and they really appreciate what it's adding to their agricultural operation. So as you've seen through this presentation, the steps in composting are numerous. There's a lot of different people involved. There's billions of microorganisms involved. And I want to really acknowledge and thank each of the people in the Bow Valley who've been involved in developing our community compost programs and in participating in our compost programs, from collecting food scraps at home, in our businesses, in our institutions, to using compost. And I look forward to hearing from those who collect compost at the Kenmore Compost Giveaway tomorrow to hear how that compost feeds their garden and helps their plants grow. So thank you to all of the people in our community who have been involved. Here you can see a few people using compost bins. We can see some of the staff from the town of Banff emptying a compost bin, people in restaurants, in businesses in Canmore who are just getting underway with diverting organics in their businesses. And we're very grateful to each of you for your role in this program. Thank you to Pascale Ouellette for her recent work in creating such beautiful artwork that adorns the bins around town and I think inspires us in a different way and reminds us of the beauty of art around us, even in these projects that are very practical in their nature in our community. And if you have any questions about how to go about composting in your business or your home, please reach out to your local municipality, to the town of Banff, to the town of Kenmore. If you live in another Bow Valley community and you don't have access to composting yet, feel free to reach out and maybe explore how your community might be able to start composting. And I would like to just say a special thanks to the town of Canmore, town of Banff for their leadership in establishing organics diversion programs, managing them and operating them in creative and thoughtful ways. I'd like to say thanks to the town of Canmore for sharing a few of their images of their program that I could include in this presentation. I'd like to thank the Bow Valley Food Alliance for hosting this presentation, and special thanks to Marie-Ève Marchand and Alyssa Salins for making it possible to make this little video. And I want to thank each and every person who participates in organics diversion in the Bow Valley each and every day. Thank you and have a great day.